The promise to return, the true story of a war doctor. The military base was wrapped in the tense silence of the early morning when Michael Johnson received the news that would change his life forever. He sat in his small barracks room, the dim light illuminating the stacks of medical papers and bandages he used daily in the field hospital. On his laptop, the last video call with Sarah still echoed in his mind. She had smiled at him, tired but glowing, resting her hand on her now visibly large belly. "He kicked again today," she said, her eyes shining. Michael smiled. "He's going to be strong, just like his mom. Or stubborn, just like his dad," she teased, laughing. But behind her laughter, there was a painful truth neither of them dared to say out loud. Michael was far away, too far. Time was passing, and the war felt endless. He had promised he would return before the baby was born, but reality was cruel. No promise could change fate in the middle of a battlefield. He ran a hand through his hair, exhausted. The last few months had been a whirlwind. Ever since he decided to enlist as a medical officer in the army, everything had happened too fast. He remembered the night he told Sarah about his decision. It was a cold evening in Boston, and they were sitting on the couch, each holding a steaming cup of tea. "I have to do this," he said, hesitantly. Sarah stayed silent for a long time. Then she sighed. "I knew this day would come," she replied, looking at him with sadness. "I don't want to leave you, but I've always known I wanted to be more than just a doctor in a safe hospital. My grandfather, he taught me that some battles are worth fighting." "I know, Michael. But what about us?" It was the first time he didn't know how to answer, and yet she stood by his side. They married before he left, and when he deployed, Sarah was just beginning to suspect she might be pregnant. By the time it was confirmed, he was already thousands of miles away, and now here he was, alone, hearing the distant echoes of bombs, trying to hold on to the hope that he could make it back in time. But could he? He reached for the small pendant Sarah had given him before he left, gripping it tightly between his fingers. It was a tiny medal with a simple engraving. "Come home." The promise still stood, but time was working against him. The first thing that hit Michael Johnson about the war wasn't the heat. It was the smell. When he first set foot at the military base in Iraq, the scorching sun was unbearable, making sweat soak through his uniform within minutes. But the smell was something no training had prepared him for. A mix of dust, dried blood, burnt metal, and sweat clung to the air, a constant reminder that this was a place where death was always near. Michael barely had time to settle in before the first casualties arrived. Helicopters touched down in rapid succession, carrying injured soldiers from the battlefield. Some screamed in agony, others were eerily silent, their bodies limp and lifeless. Inside the field hospital, Michael froze for a brief second as he took it all in. The rows of stretchers, the sound of machines beeping, the chaotic voices shouting orders. A nurse rushed past him, barely sparing a glance. "New doctor?" he asked, tossing a pair of bloodied gloves at Michael. Michael caught them, nodding. "Welcome to hell." There was no time for introductions, no time for hesitation. War didn't wait. The hours blurred together. Michael stitched wounds, stopped bleeding, administered morphine to men who clung to consciousness by a thread. Each patient was a battle against death. That night, long after the last soldier had been stabilized or lost, Michael sat in a quiet corner of the medical tent. His uniform was soaked in blood, not his own, but it didn't matter. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from exhaustion. He pulled out his laptop, hoping the internet connection would hold long enough for a call. A few seconds later, Sarah's face appeared on the screen. "Hey," she said softly. Michael exhaled. Just seeing her made everything feel a little lighter. "Hey, love," she studied his face, frowning. "Rough day?" He didn't want to lie, but he didn't want to worry her either. "Yeah, but I'm okay. How are you?" Sarah gave a small smile. The baby was kicking all day. I think he misses you. Michael ran a hand over his tired face, his heart aching. I miss him too, and his mom. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with all the words they couldn't say. Then, suddenly, boom! An explosion in the distance. The ground shook slightly. Alarms blared outside. Michael turned his head sharply toward the entrance of the tent, already hearing urgent voices and heavy footsteps. Michael, what was that? Sarah's voice trembled. He forced himself to smile. It's nothing, love. I have to go. I'll call you later. I love you. The screen flickered before the connection cut off. Michael shut the laptop and jumped to his feet. The war wasn't over, and it never slept. Time blurred. Days turned into weeks, and Michael Johnson stopped counting. Out here, in the middle of a war that never seemed to end, there were no weekends, no breaks, just the endless cycle of life and death. The field hospital never emptied. Every sunrise brought new wounded soldiers, and every sunset carried away those who didn't make it. But the worst part wasn't the exhaustion. It was knowing that, with each passing day, the chances of returning home in time were slipping away. Michael tried to hold on to hope. Sarah was now in her third trimester. Every time he managed to call her, he could see how tired she looked, how much heavier her belly had grown, how much she needed him. One night, after yet another brutal shift, he finally managed to get a call through. Sarah's face appeared on the screen. Michael. Her voice was soft, exhausted. He frowned. Are you okay? She hesitated. I had a checkup yesterday. The doctor says the baby is fine, but I need to rest more. My body is getting too tired. Michael felt a sharp pain in his chest. He should be there with her. He should be driving her to her appointments, holding her hand, taking care of her. But instead, he was here, a world away. Sarah, She smiled sadly. I know. He swallowed hard. What if I don't make it in time? The words slipped out before he could stop them. A silence stretched between them. Finally, Sarah whispered, You will. Michael nodded, but deep down he wasn't so sure anymore. That night, lying on his thin cot in the barracks, he stared at the ceiling. He could still hear distant gunfire, could still smell the blood on his hands, but all he could think about was home, and the possibility that he might never see it again. Michael woke up that morning with a strange feeling in his chest. There was something different in the air. A heavy silence loomed over the base, the kind that made soldiers uneasy, the kind that came before something bad. He barely had time to process it before the alarm started blaring. A patrol had been ambushed. Chaos erupted across the base. Urgent radio transmissions filled the air, shouting coordinates, orders. Helicopters roared overhead, carrying the wounded. Michael ran toward the field hospital, his heart hammering in his chest. When he got there, he saw the blood. The first wave of injured soldiers had arrived. Some limped in with minor wounds. Others were carried in, their bodies limp and lifeless. Then, a group of medics rushed in with a stretcher. Gunshot wound, lost a lot of blood. We need a doctor now. Michael ran to them. A high-ranking officer lay on the stretcher, pale and barely conscious. A bullet had torn through his leg, hitting a major artery. If Michael didn't act fast, he was going to die. Hold him down, Michael ordered, grabbing the surgical tools. The officer gasped for air, his hands weakly clutching at the blood-soaked uniform. Explosions rumbled in the distance. The base was still under attack, but Michael didn't stop. He pressed down on the wound, working quickly. Blood poured over his gloves. A sharp pain shot through his back as another blast shook the tent, but he kept going. He stitched. He clamped. He stabilized. By the time he finished, the man was still breathing. One of the nurses stared at him in disbelief. You just saved his life. Michael took a deep breath, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked at the unconscious officer. It didn't feel like a victory. It just felt like another battle won in a war that never ended. Then, a voice broke through the chaos. Johnson, Captain wants to see you." Michael exchanged glances with the other medics before following the soldier outside. The base was still on high alert, but his captain stood near a command post, waiting for him. Michael saluted. "Sir?" The captain studied him for a moment. "Do you know who that man was?" Michael shook his head. "A very important officer, and it looks like someone up top wants to thank you." Michael frowned. "What does that mean?" The captain crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "It means you've been granted emergency leave. You're going home." Michael blinked. Did he hear that right? "What?" "Your flight leaves in a few hours. Pack your things." For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then, realization hit him like a wave. He was going home. To Sarah. To his son. Tears welled in his eyes before he could stop them. The captain smirked and clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Go, before someone changes their mind." Michael didn't need to be told twice. The race against time had begun. Michael had never packed so fast in his life. His bunk at the base, which had been his home for months, now felt small and insignificant. Everything in this place was a reminder of how far he had been from what really mattered. He grabbed his few belongings, stuffing them into his duffel bag. His hands trembled as he picked up the small pendant Sarah had given him before he left. He clutched it tightly. Come home. Now, finally, he was on his way. The helicopter ride to the airstrip was quick, but the wait for clearance to leave felt endless. Every delay was torture. Every second that passed was one less second he had to get to Sarah before the baby was born. When he finally boarded the military plane back to the US, he could barely breathe. He sat in silence, gripping the armrests as the aircraft took off. His heart pounded with every mile they traveled. But there was one fear he couldn't shake. What if he was too late? The journey home felt like a nightmare. Every layover, every checkpoint, every delay chipped away at his patience. He couldn't afford to be late. At one stop, he managed to connect to a weak Wi-Fi signal and immediately called Sarah. The phone rang for what felt like forever before she finally picked up. "Michael!" Her voice was weak, breathless. His stomach dropped. "What's wrong?" "I'm at the hospital. I'm in labor." Michael's blood ran cold. "Now! It's happening now!" Sarah gave a small, strained laugh. "Yeah, looks like he couldn't wait." Michael ran a hand over his face, trying to control his breathing. "Sarah, listen to me. I'm on my way. I'm almost there. Please, just hold on." "I'll try," she whispered. Then the call dropped. Michael stared at the black screen. No, he couldn't miss this. He had to make it. When his plane finally landed in the US, Michael didn't waste a second. The moment he cleared customs, he sprinted through the airport, barely registering the people around him. He ran straight to the ticket counter. "I need a flight to Boston." "The soonest possible," the woman behind the desk typed quickly. Frowning, "The next available flight is in 2 hours." Michael clenched his jaw. "Nothing sooner." She hesitated, scanning the screen. "There's one leaving now, but put me on it." She blinked in surprise. "Sir, it's boarding." "I don't care. Put me on that plane." She didn't argue. A minute later, Michael had a ticket in hand and was sprinting toward the gate. He barely made it before they closed the doors. As he collapsed into his seat, heart pounding, he exhaled shakily. One last stretch. Just a little longer. When the plane landed in Boston, Michael didn't even wait for the seatbelt sign to turn off. He grabbed his bag and bolted through the airport. He barely took a second to catch his breath before jumping into the first taxi he could find. Boston General Hospital. Fast. The driver, an older man with a thick accent, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Big rush, huh?" Michael ran a hand through his hair, his whole body vibrating with urgency. "My wife is having our baby. I need to be there." The driver's eyes widened. "Hang on tight." The car shot forward. Michael gripped the seat. He was so close, but would he make it in time? The taxi sped through the streets of Boston like a bullet. Michael's knee bounced anxiously. He checked his phone. No messages, no updates. His heart pounded against his ribs. He was so close. But was he close enough? The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. How far along is she? Michael swallowed hard. She's already in labor. I should have been there hours ago. The driver nodded and pressed harder on the gas. I'll get you there, buddy. Michael gritted his teeth as he watched the city blur past. The seconds felt like hours. Then, finally, the hospital came into view. Before the car even stopped, Michael was throwing cash at the driver and jumping out. Good luck, the man called after him. Michael didn't respond. He was already running. He burst through the hospital doors. The woman at the front desk barely had time to react before he was at the counter, out of breath. Sarah Johnson, she's in labor. Where is she? The receptionist typed quickly. 3rd floor, maternity ward. Michael didn't wait. He sprinted down the hallway, past nurses and doctors, ignoring the confused stares. He didn't stop for anything. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't slow down. Then, at the end of the hall, he saw it. The door to the delivery room was open. A nurse stepped out, holding a pair of gloves and medical supplies. Her eyes widened when she saw him. Are you the husband? Michael gasped for air. Yes. Sarah, go! You made it just in time! Michael rushed inside, and then he saw her. Sarah lay in the hospital bed, drenched in sweat, gripping the rails as the doctors guided her through the final moments of labor. When her eyes landed on him, a sob broke from her lips. Michael! He ran to her side, grabbing her hand. I'm here. I promised, didn't I? His voice shook with emotion. She let out a choked laugh, tears streaming down her face. You always keep your promises. The doctor's voice cut through the moment. All right, Sarah, one last push. Michael squeezed her hand. You can do this, baby. I'm right here. Sarah gritted her teeth and pushed with everything she had. Then, the sound of a baby's cry filled the room. Michael felt his breath catch. One of the nurses took the tiny, crying newborn, quickly wrapping him in a soft blanket before gently placing him in Sarah's arms. She let out a broken laugh, completely overwhelmed. Michael, look at him. Michael stared at his son. His son. Tears blurred his vision as he reached out with shaking hands, gently brushing his fingers over the baby's soft skin. He let out a shaky breath. He's perfect. A lump formed in his throat. For months, Michael had only known death. He had held dying men in his arms, felt their final breaths, watched as life slipped away. But now, he was holding life. And it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Michael Johnson held his son as if he were the most precious thing in the world, because he was. The tiny newborn squirmed slightly in his arms, his face still red, his eyes barely open, adjusting to the world around him, the world Michael had fought so hard to come back to. A lump formed in his throat, and before he could stop himself, tears welled up in his eyes, not from sadness, not from pain, but from something far more powerful. Sarah, exhausted but glowing, watched him with soft eyes. You're already in love with him, aren't you? She murmured. Michael let out a breathless laugh, never taking his eyes off the baby. I didn't know it was possible to love someone this much, this fast. Sarah chuckled weakly. Now you understand how I've felt all these months. Michael finally looked up at her, and that's when it hit him. She had been so strong. While he had been fighting a war on the battlefield, she had been fighting her own war, alone, carrying their child, enduring every moment of fear, every sleepless night, every doctor's visit without him by her side. He reached out and took her hand in his, squeezing gently. I'm so sorry I wasn't here. Sarah squeezed back, shaking her head. You're here now. Michael took in a deep, shaky breath. He looked down at his son again, watching as the baby's tiny hand instinctively gripped his finger. It was real. He had made it. After all the blood, the war, the endless nights of doubt and fear. He had won his most important battle, and now, holding his son, he finally understood. This was what he had been fighting for all along. The hospital room was quiet now, a different kind of quiet than Michael Johnson was used to. It wasn't the eerie silence of a field hospital after a brutal battle, where the air was thick with the weight of life and death. This was peaceful. He sat beside Sarah's bed, one hand holding hers, the other resting gently on his son's tiny belly. He could hardly believe it. Just hours ago, he had been racing through airports, running through hospital hallways, terrified he wouldn't make it. And now, he was here. Sarah watched him with tired but loving eyes. "You should sleep." Her voice was soft. Michael shook his head. "I don't want to miss a second." She smiled. "You're going to be a great dad." Michael felt his throat tighten. "I just want to be here, for both of you." Sarah's fingers brushed against his, understanding exactly what he meant. Before either of them could say more, a quiet knock sounded at the door. A nurse peeked inside, smiling. "I have some very eager people waiting to see you." Sarah looked at Michael. He nodded. "Let them in." The door opened, and his parents rushed in first. His mother, Carol, gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Michael barely had time to react before she was embracing him, crying against his shoulder. I thought you wouldn't make it in time." Michael held her tight. "I almost didn't." His father, Robert, stood nearby, eyes slightly red but his expression steady. He placed a firm hand on Michael's shoulder. "You did good, son. I'm proud of you." Michael swallowed hard. Hearing those words meant more than he could explain. Then Sarah's parents came forward, beaming with pride. Her mother leaned over, gently touching the baby's cheek. "He's perfect." Her father chuckled, looking at Michael. "And he got here just in time, huh?" Everyone laughed. For the first time in what felt like forever, Michael felt completely, truly happy. The family spent the next hour together, passing the baby around, taking turns holding him, crying tears of joy. At one point, Sarah's mother turned to them with a curious smile. "So, have you two decided on a name?" Sarah and Michael exchanged a glance. Michael took a deep breath and looked down at his son. "Then Trey," he whispered it softly, like a promise. "Nathan." Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. "Nathan Johnson." Michael let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He had spent so much time saving lives on the battlefield, but this was the only life that truly mattered. The night passed slowly at the hospital. Michael Johnson refused to sleep. Even though exhaustion weighed on him, he couldn't take his eyes off his son. His family had left hours ago, leaving the room quiet again. The only sounds were the soft beeping of monitors and Nathan's tiny breaths. Michael sat beside Sarah's hospital bed, holding her hand in one of his and gently resting the other on Nathan's small belly. He didn't want to miss a second. Sarah, groggy but smiling, watched him. "You really should sleep, you know." Michael shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "I can sleep later. Right now, I just want to be here." She squeezed his hand. "How much time do you have before you have to go back?" Michael's chest tightened. He had been trying to avoid that thought. "A few days," he admitted quietly. Sarah's smile faltered, but she nodded. She knew this moment would come. "Then let's make the most of it." Michael took a deep breath. "Yeah, let's." The next few days were the best of his life. Sarah was discharged from the hospital, and they finally returned home. For the first time in months, Michael was home. The soft couch, the warmth of their bed, the smell of coffee brewing in the morning, all the little things he had taken for granted before he left. But more than anything, he cherished every second with Nathan. Whenever the baby stirred in the middle of the night, Michael was the first to pick him up. "You need to rest," Sarah would say. "I'll rest later," he'd reply, rocking Nathan gently. "I've already missed too much." And he meant it. He could have spent hours just watching his son breathe, memorizing every tiny detail of his face. For the first time in a long time, there was no war, no blood, no explosions, only peace. On the third day, Michael got an unexpected visitor. He was in the living room, rocking Nathan in his arms, when there was a knock at the door. Sarah went to answer it. To Michael's surprise, his unit captain was standing there. He wasn't in uniform, but his posture was as rigid as always. Michael frowned, standing up cautiously. "Captain," the man smiled slightly. "Johnson, I wanted to deliver this news in person." Michael's stomach twisted. Were they calling him back early? His hands instinctively tightened around Nathan as he braced himself. The captain crossed his arms. "Your emergency leave has been extended." Michael blinked. "What? You have another month at home?" Sarah gasped behind him. Michael stared at the captain, trying to process what he had just said. "How?" The captain smirked. "That officer you saved? Turns out he has friends in high places. He made sure you got more time with your family." Michael felt a rush of relief so intense that his knees nearly buckled. Sarah covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "Michael, you can stay." He looked down at Nathan, then at Sarah. Then, for the first time since he left for war, he felt like he could finally breathe. He turned back to the captain, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." That night, as he lay in bed with Sarah, watching Nathan sleep peacefully in his crib, Michael knew something for certain. The war wasn't over. One day, he would have to go back. But for now, he was home. And that was all that mattered. The house was quiet that night. Michael Johnson couldn't sleep. Sarah lay beside him, exhausted but peaceful, while Nathan slept soundly in his crib. The soft glow of the nightlight cast a warm hue over the room. Michael sat in the chair next to the crib, watching his son's tiny chest rise and fall with each breath. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly over Nathan's small hand. The baby twitched, but didn't wake. Michael swallowed hard. For months, he had lived in a world of chaos. He had held dying men in his arms. He had fought to save lives in a war that never seemed to end. He had lost friends, seen the worst of humanity, and wondered, time and time again, if he would ever make it back home. And yet here he was. Sarah had been right. He had made it. He looked over at her, her chest rising and falling in steady breaths, and his heart clenched. She had been the one to hold everything together. While he was overseas, fighting an enemy he could see, she had been here, fighting an invisible battle. The loneliness, the fear, the uncertainty. She had done it all alone. Michael took a deep breath, rubbing his hands over his tired face. Never again. He didn't know how much longer the war would last. He didn't know how many more times he would have to leave. But one thing was certain. This was the life he was fighting for. Sarah, Nathan, his family. The days passed slowly, filled with firsts that Michael never took for granted. The first time Nathan gripped his finger, the first time he opened his eyes and seemed to truly see his father. The quiet moments at night, rocking his son back and forth, whispering promises he intended to keep. Michael knew he wouldn't be home forever, but he also knew that no matter how far he went, he would always find his way back. Then, the day of departure finally came. Michael stood at the doorway, his packed bag at his feet. Sarah held Nathan in her arms, her eyes already glistening with tears. "I hate this," she whispered. Michael cupped her face gently. "Me too." She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. "How do we do this again?" Michael swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "One day at a time." Sarah nodded, blinking back tears. Michael leaned down and kissed Nathan's forehead, letting the warmth of his son's skin imprint on his lips. The baby stirred, but didn't wake. Michael exhaled shakily. He didn't want to go, but he had to. He straightened up, looking at Sarah one last time. "I'll come back." She let out a trembling breath. "I know." Michael pulled her into his arms, holding her like he never wanted to let go. Then slowly, he stepped back, picked up his bag, and walked toward the waiting car. Before getting in, he turned around one last time. Sarah stood at the door, holding Nathan close. And for a brief moment, Michael felt something unexplainable. Something deeper than words, a promise, a certainty. No matter what happened, no matter how far he had to go, he would always find his way home. And that made all the difference. And that's the end of this incredible story. A powerful journey of love, sacrifice, and the promise to always come home. If this story moved you, don't forget to give this video a like. It really helps us out. And if you love emotional, gripping stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.